30 years after her brother's death, a girl receives a video in which he is still talking to her. The road to Cold Creek was exactly as Maggie remembered, narrow, winding through endless stretches of towering pines, the kind that made it seem like the sky was barely there. The early autumn chill seeped through the car windows, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. It was the kind of cold that wasn't just felt on the skin, but settled somewhere deeper in the bones. She hadn't been back in years, maybe a decade. The town had a way of keeping people away, or maybe it was just her own reluctance. Either way, the weight of memory pressed down heavier with each passing mile. Then, like something emerging from the mist, Cold Creek appeared. The same squat buildings, the same faded signage, the same tired streets. The town was neither decayed nor thriving. It simply was. The kind of place where the days folded into each other without much fuss. Where the past didn't just linger, it never left. Maggie pulled into a spot outside what had once been Ray's Diner, now just Cold Creek Cafe, though even that change felt half-hearted. The sign flickered unevenly, buzzing faintly in the crisp air. She killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at her reflection in the rear-view mirror. A woman in her 50s, eyes sharper than they used to be, framed by lines that weren't just from age, but from knowing too much. She exhaled, grabbed her coat, and stepped out. The street was nearly empty, save for an old man sitting outside the general store, a toothpick rolling between his lips as he watched her with the kind of quiet recognition that sent a chill up her spine. People here still remembered. They always did. Maggie walked, slow and deliberate, past buildings that had once been background scenery to a life she barely recognized now. The grocery store where she and Jonathan used to beg their mother for candy. The library where he spent hours, nose buried in thick books about history, mythology, things he used to say mattered. She could still hear his voice, laughing, arguing, always questioning, and then, one day, gone. The memorial was just ahead. It sat on a patch of land near the old church, a modest slab of stone with names etched in neat, somber rows. Jonathan Sullivan. The letters were worn but solid, unchanging. Just like the silence that followed the night he disappeared. Maggie crouched down, running her fingers over the engraving. The coolness of the stone sent a shiver through her. Behind her, the crunch of boots against gravel. She turned, already knowing who it was before she saw him. Bobby Hayes. He had aged, but not poorly, just in that way men who had spent too much time under the sun and too much time thinking did. His hair was mostly grey, his shoulders a little heavier, but his eyes were the same. Watchful, wary. "I figured I'd see you here," he said, voice rough from years of cigarettes and regret. Maggie stood, brushing dust from her jeans. "I didn't think you'd still be around." Bobby let out something between a chuckle and a sigh. "Some of us don't get to leave." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of burning wood from somewhere far off, mixing with the damp air. Finally, Bobby cleared his throat. "Listen, Maggie, He hesitated, rubbed his jaw like he was working something loose. "There's something you should have." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, his fingers hesitating before extending it toward her. A USB drive. Maggie frowned. "What is this?" Bobby didn't meet her eyes. "Jonathan gave it to me. Before the trip." A sharp, cold pulse ran through her. She took the drive carefully, as if it might crumble in her hands. "You've had this all these years?" Bobby nodded, his gaze fixed on the memorial stone. I never looked at it. I couldn't, but I think maybe it's time you did." Her fingers curled around the device, the weight of it insignificant compared to what it might hold. Silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded. Maggie searched his face, looking for something, some hint of what he wasn't saying. "Why now, Bobby?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. He shook his head. "Because I'm tired. Of remembering, of pretending I don't." Maggie swallowed. The Cold Creek wind curled around them, rustling the leaves at their feet, whispering between the trees. She glanced down at the USB again, her pulse slow but deep, like something had shifted in the air around her. For the first time in years, something inside her stirred. A door, long sealed shut, creaked open. The Cold Creek Motel was the kind of place where time had settled into the furniture and refused to leave. The walls were stained with years of cigarette smoke, the carpet stiff from too many spills and too few cleanings. The air smelled damp, tinged with something faintly metallic, as if the past had been sealed in and left to ferment. Maggie closed the door behind her and exhaled. The room was small, barely furnished, just a bed with a sagging mattress, a scratched wooden desk, and a chair that wobbled when she sat down. The single lamp on the nightstand cast a dim yellow glow, flickering every so often like it was second-guessing its own purpose. She set her bag on the bed and pulled out the USB drive Bobby had given her, holding it between her fingers. It was small, unremarkable, yet it carried the weight of 3 decades of silence. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Then, slowly, she opened her laptop. The screen illuminated the room with its cold, artificial light. Maggie plugged in the USB, her hands steady, but her breathing shallow. A single file appeared, Blackwood_1989.mp4. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. Click. The video flickered to life, the screen bursting into a mess of static before stabilizing. A grainy image of a forest appeared. Blackwood, unmistakable, its dense trees forming an endless wall of darkness behind the group of laughing, carefree students. Jonathan was at the center of the frame. Maggie sucked in a breath. He looked exactly as she remembered him. Messy dark hair, an easy, crooked smile, a confidence that had always felt just a little reckless. He was sitting on a log, grinning, talking to someone off camera. Around him, the others, faces she barely recognized, faces she had only ever seen in faded newspaper clippings, were setting up camp, unaware, unconcerned. The footage was rough, shaky, shot from what looked like a handheld camcorder. Someone, probably Jonathan, was narrating in that teasing, amused voice of his. "Welcome to the Great Blackwood Expedition, starring a bunch of overconfident idiots who think they can survive the weekend." Laughter. Someone threw a pine cone at him. Maggie's throat tightened. This was Jonathan, alive, moving, speaking. She forced herself to focus. The camera panned across tents being assembled, a fire pit being dug. The forest was deep, alive with the sounds of wind shifting through trees, distant bird calls. The light was starting to fade, the sky burning into shades of deep purple and amber. And then, a flicker. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the poor quality, the kind of visual noise that came with old recordings, but when the camera panned back, she saw it, a figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing. Maggie paused the video, fingers tightening on the trackpad. The figure was partially obscured, blurred by distance and the limitations of the camera, but there was something off. He wasn't moving. Everyone else in the footage was in motion, laughing, walking, setting up camp. But the figure stood completely still, like he wasn't supposed to be there. Maggie leaned closer, her pulse quickening. She rewound the video, let it play again. The camera jostled as the person filming, Jonathan, shifted positions. The group was oblivious, too engaged in their own world to notice the watcher in the trees. Maggie pressed pause again, squinting. The figure was wearing something dark, heavy, almost like a uniform, the outline of a jacket, something vaguely military in its shape. And on the chest, a patch. She zoomed in, the pixels breaking apart into a mess of distortion. But she could still make out 3 letters. GLC. Her breath hitched. Grayson Lumber Company. Her hands felt suddenly cold, her skin prickling. Grayson Lumber had been shut down for years before Jonathan's trip. The records had been clear. No one had been working in the forest at the time. No loggers, no guards, no one. So who the hell was this? Maggie clicked play, watching as the footage continued. Jonathan was still talking, joking about how they'd survive on pure bravado and cheap beer. The camera angle shifted, the person behind it turning toward the tents, just for a second, before swinging back. The man was gone. Maggie paused the video again, rewound, played it frame by frame. 1 second he was there, the next empty trees. A heavy silence filled the room. Maggie sat back in her chair, staring at the frozen image on the screen. Her heartbeat was slow, deliberate, the kind that only came with a sinking realization. She knew what this meant. Jonathan had seen something. He might not have known it at the time. He might have brushed it off, never noticed it at all. But someone had been watching them in Blackwood. And whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be there. Maggie exhaled sharply, pushing a hand through her hair. The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet. The past had always haunted her, but tonight it felt closer than ever, like something just outside the motel door, waiting. Her laptop screen flickered, the video still frozen on that single frame, the figure standing in the woods, silent, watching, waiting. The Cold Creek Library smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of scent that clung to the past and refused to let go. The building itself was small, tucked between an abandoned hardware store and a diner that had long since stopped pretending to care about its customers. Maggie stepped inside, the heavy wooden door groaning on its hinges. The place was almost empty, save for an elderly man hunched over a newspaper in the corner and a librarian behind the desk, an older woman with sharp eyes and silver-streaked hair pinned neatly in a bun. Maggie approached the desk, the creaking floorboards beneath her steps breaking the silence. The woman barely looked up. "Need help?" Maggie hesitated for half a second before pulling her notepad from her coat pocket. "I'm looking for old records on Grayson Lumber Company, anything from the 80s. That made the woman look up. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if Maggie had just stepped into something she shouldn't be touching. Why? Maggie had spent enough years as a journalist to recognize when someone knew more than they were willing to say. She leaned against the counter, keeping her voice casual. "I'm working on a piece about abandoned industrial sites." A lie, but close enough. The librarian's lips pressed into a thin line. That place should have been left to rot. Maggie didn't blink. "Why is that?" The woman's eyes flicked toward the newspaper man in the corner before lowering her voice. "Because nothing good ever came out of that company, and the people who stuck their noses where they didn't belong." She let the sentence hang unfinished. Maggie's grip on her notepad tightened. The woman sighed, as if suddenly exhausted, then waved a hand toward the back of the library. "Archives are in the basement. Microfilm, newspaper clippings. If it still exists, it's down there." Maggie nodded in thanks and made her way toward the stairs. The basement was colder than the rest of the library, the air thick with age and forgotten things. Rows of filing cabinets and wooden shelves lined the walls, each labeled in fading ink. She found the newspaper archives tucked in the back, the pages yellowed, edges curling. She pulled a stack free and began reading. "Grayson Lumber to shut down operations. November 1988. A sudden announcement from CEO Richard Grayson confirms the company will be ceasing operations after 40 years of business. The closure follows a series of financial struggles, though some speculate it has more to do with environmental regulations and a growing number of accidents on site. 3 loggers injured in mysterious incident, August 1986. 3 employees of Grayson Lumber were hospitalized following an unexplained event near the Blackwood site. Witnesses report hearing inhuman sounds before the collapse of an equipment storage unit. The company has refused to comment on the incident. Foreman missing after overnight shift. June the 29th, 1985. Local authorities are investigating the disappearance of Arthur Mills, a foreman at Grayson Lumber who failed to return home after a late shift. His truck was found abandoned near the entrance of Blackwood Forest. Company officials claim there is no evidence of foul play. Mills' family remains unconvinced. Maggie's breath caught. The same forest. The same place Jonathan and his friends had disappeared. She kept flipping, the ink smudging against her fingertips until she found it. C.O. Grayson. Grayson sells remaining assets, January 1000. 990. Following the closure of Grayson Lumber, Richard Grayson has reportedly moved into a private estate near Elk Valley, just miles from Blackwood Forest. The former CEO has remained largely out of the public eye since the shutdown, declining multiple requests for interviews. Maggie sat back, heart thudding. He was still here, living near the woods. She exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temples. This wasn't just a closed logging company. This was something else, something that had been ignored, buried, just like Jonathan's disappearance. and Richard Grayson was the only one left who might have answers. Later that night, Bobby refused to come with her. They were sitting in his truck, parked just outside the library, the streetlights flickering unevenly. Bobby had barely looked at her after she told him what she found. His hands gripped the steering wheel like he was holding onto something far heavier. "Maggie," he muttered, shaking his head. "If you go looking for ghosts, you might not like what you find." She turned in her seat, watching his jaw tighten, his eyes cloud with something dangerously close to fear. "You're telling me you never wondered?" she pressed. Bobby let out a slow, uneven breath. "Of course I did, for years." He finally turned to look at her. "But sometimes, wondering is safer than knowing." Silence settled between them. Maggie pulled the USB from her coat pocket, flipping it between her fingers. "Jonathan left this with you? Didn't you ever ask yourself why?" Bobby's throat worked around something unsaid. Finally, he whispered, "Every damn day." For a moment, neither spoke. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before looking out the window. "Just be careful, Maggie." She reached for the door handle, pausing just long enough to say, "I never like playing it safe." And with that, she stepped into the night. The road to Elk Valley was long and empty. Maggie drove in silence, her headlights cutting through the thickening fog that curled around the trees. Richard Grayson's house was out there, somewhere near Blackwood, standing like a relic from another life. The further she drove, the more the town faded behind her. Just trees now, nothing but trees, their silhouettes reaching high and unmoving against the night sky. It was quiet. Too quiet. Maggie gripped the wheel tighter, forcing her mind to focus. Her brother had come here 3 decades ago, thinking it was just another weekend trip. He had never come back. Now she was following the same road, chasing ghosts through the trees, and something told her she wasn't the only one out here. The road to Richard Grayson's house twisted like an old scar through the forest, barely more than a dirt path strangled by tangled undergrowth. Maggie's tires crunched over loose gravel, her headlights casting long shadows between the towering pines. The deeper she drove into Elk Valley, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind, just the steady hum of her own engine and the weight of the past pressing against her ribs. The house appeared like a forgotten thing at the end of the road, standing against the tree line like it had grown from the forest itself. The cabin was old but not abandoned, the kind of place where someone lived without wanting to be seen. The windows were dark, the porch sagging at the edges, but there was wood stacked neatly against the side and a faint curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Whoever had tried to disappear here hadn't done it entirely. Maggie pulled the car to a stop and killed the engine. Silence fell like a weight. She stepped out, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. For a moment, she just stood there, listening. The trees seemed to breathe around her, shifting with a presence she couldn't quite name. The house was watching, or maybe it was just the past, waiting for her to cross the threshold. She climbed the porch steps, the wood groaning under her weight. She knocked. No answer. The silence stretched, thick and unbroken. She knocked again, harder this time, the sound echoing into the trees, still nothing. Maggie exhaled sharply. She knew someone was inside, she could feel it, the weight of presence pressing just beyond the door. Then, a sound. A soft creak, like the whisper of old wood giving way beneath a careful step. She turned and froze. Standing just inside the dim glow of the porch light was a woman, young, maybe early 30s, maybe younger, but it wasn't her age that stopped Maggie cold. It was her eyes. Jonathan's eyes. Maggie felt the breath leave her lungs in a slow, disbelieving rush. The woman, Charlotte, stared at her with an expression that was half fear, half something unreadable. Behind her, the door opened a few inches more, and Richard Grayson stepped into the light. The years had settled heavily onto him, carving deep lines into his face. His hair was mostly white, his frame still solid but worn, like something built to endure but never quite meant to last this long. His eyes flicked to Charlotte, then back to Maggie. He sighed. "You shouldn't have come here." The living room, dimly lit and full of ghosts inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and old paper, the kind of smell that settled deep into walls and refused to leave. The living room was cluttered but lived in. Books stacked on every available surface, an old fireplace still burning low, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. Maggie stood near the doorway, her muscles coiled with something she couldn't name. Across from her, Charlotte perched on the edge of a faded armchair, hands curled around a ceramic mug like it was the only solid thing in the room. Richard remained standing, watching, waiting. Maggie's voice came out low, controlled. "She looks like him." Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Charlotte glanced at him, then at Maggie. Her fingers tightened on the mug, her throat working around words she hadn't spoken yet. Then, softly, almost too softly to be real, she said, "You knew him." Maggie's chest clenched around a pain she hadn't prepared for. "I was his sister," she said. Charlotte's breath hitched, just barely, but Maggie saw it. The flicker of something breaking apart and piecing itself back together in real time. Richard finally spoke. "She doesn't need to know everything." His voice was gravel, roughened by years of silence. Maggie turned to him, eyes sharp. "But I do." Richard exhaled through his nose, looking old, impossibly old. "It's been 34 years, Margaret. What do you think you'll find?" She took a step forward. The firelight caught the edges of her face. Hard, unrelenting. "Answers." Richard shook his head. "There are no answers that will bring him back." Maggie's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I'm not looking for a resurrection," she said quietly. "I'm looking for the truth." The girl with Jonathan's eyes. Charlotte set her mug down. Her hands were steady, but her voice wasn't when she finally spoke. "My mother," she started, then stopped, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the table in front of her. "She never talked about him, about any of it," she swallowed. "But I always knew there was something missing, something she was running from." She looked up, her gaze searching Maggie's face like it held something she'd been waiting for all her life. Maggie's chest ached. Charlotte inhaled, slow, steady. She said she left Blackwood because it wasn't safe, because something happened there, something she wasn't supposed to see. Maggie barely breathed. Richard's voice was tired, worn at the edges. "She wasn't supposed to survive," he said. "None of them were." The room plunged into silence. Charlotte went still, her knuckles white against the tabletop. Maggie felt the blood in her veins turn cold. "What did you say?" Richard didn't repeat himself, didn't have to. The weight of his words sank into the room, thick and suffocating. The name no one spoke, Richard Grayson ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. "I tried to fix it," he murmured. "Tried to keep the truth buried. For all of our sakes." Maggie's voice was razor-edged. "What truth?" Richard looked at her then, really looked at her, as if measuring whether she could survive what came next. Then, finally, there was an experiment in Blackwood. Charlotte flinched. Maggie's stomach dropped. Richard continued, voice low. "It was never about logging. That was just the front. Grayson Lumber was covering something else, something bigger." The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Maggie forced the words through clenched teeth. "And my brother, did he know?" Richard's eyes darkened. "Jonathan knew enough," he said. "Enough to get himself killed." Charlotte let out a sharp breath, like something inside her had just shattered. Maggie went still, completely still. The fire crackled in the silence, its embers spitting softly, filling the room with the scent of burning wood and things left unsaid. Then, a sound outside, a soft crunch of gravel, a shift in the wind. Charlotte's eyes snapped toward the window. Maggie turned just in time to see it, a shadow moving beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. Richard cursed under his breath. Maggie reached for the lamp, but Richard grabbed her wrist, voice a sharp whisper. "Don't. If you see them, they know you see them." Maggie's pulse pounded in her throat. She turned back toward the window. The shadow was gone, but something told her this wasn't over. Not even close. The fire crackled low in the dimly lit living room, its light flickering across the walls, casting long, uneasy shadows. The air smelled of burnt wood and something faintly metallic, as if the past itself had soaked into the very bones of the house. Maggie sat on the worn-out couch, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had long since gone cold. Across from her, Charlotte sat stiffly in an old armchair, fingers curled against the edge of the fabric, as if grounding herself. Maggie's eyes flicked to the walls, lined with dusty picture frames. Most of them were empty. The outlines of old photographs remained, ghostly imprints of something that had once existed but had been carefully erased. Charlotte noticed her gaze and tensed. "Who used to be in those?" Maggie asked. Charlotte hesitated. From the far end of the room, Richard Grayson let out a sharp, rough exhale, his voice gravel and stone. "Let it be," he muttered. "You don't know what you're stirring up." Maggie's jaw tightened, but she didn't look at him. She kept her focus on Charlotte, watching as the younger woman fidgeted, pulling the sleeves of her sweater over her hands, avoiding eye contact. "You said your mother ran from something in Blackwood," Maggie pressed. "What was it?" Charlotte's gaze flickered up, then back down to her lap. She swallowed, her fingers tightening on the fabric of her jeans. Maggie leaned forward slightly. "Charlotte, if you know something, I think he's my father." The words barely made it past her lips, but the silence that followed was deafening. Maggie felt her breath catch, her pulse stutter. Richard Grayson didn't react, not at first, but Maggie saw it. A flicker in his expression, a tension in his jaw, a shift in his stance. He had known. Maggie looked at Charlotte, really looked at her. The shape of her face, the way her eyes held a familiar intensity, that quiet sharpness. Jonathan's sharpness. "Jesus," she exhaled, slow and steady, like pressing down on a rising wave of realization. "Are you sure?" she asked carefully. Charlotte nodded, but her hands trembled. "I never had proof. My mother never told me outright, but I found things. Letters, notes. She kept everything hidden, but I pieced enough of it together. The dates match, and when I found pictures of him, Her voice wavered, cracked at the edges. "I just knew." Maggie leaned back, trying to process the weight of it. Jonathan had a daughter. A daughter he never got to know, never got to protect. She felt something sharp lodged in her chest, something between grief and anger, between loss and something dangerously close to relief. Relief that some part of him hadn't been erased entirely. But Charlotte wasn't finished. She took a breath, steadied herself, and finally met Maggie's gaze. "There's something else." Maggie's fingers tightened around her mug. "Go on." Charlotte hesitated, then lowered her voice. "My mother didn't just run from Blackwood. She ran because someone was chasing her. The night she ran." Charlotte's voice was low, barely above a whisper, but Maggie could hear the tension threaded through every syllable. "My mother never told me much about that night, just pieces, things that never made sense when I was a kid. But I remember one thing clearly. She said they weren't supposed to leave the forest, and the ones who tried," Charlotte's hands curled into fists on her lap, "they made sure they never came back." Maggie felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "Who?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Charlotte shook her head. "She never said names, only that they weren't alone in those woods, that there were people watching, people making sure no one left with the truth." Richard let out a sharp breath, rubbing a hand over his face. His fingers shook, just barely, but Maggie caught it. "You don't know what you're saying," he muttered. Charlotte's eyes flashed with something sharp, something defiant. "Yes, I do." Maggie watched the exchange closely. Richard had spent years hiding something, and Charlotte had spent years trying to pull it apart. Maggie leaned forward, her voice low, steady, unrelenting. What did they see? Richard's silence was thick, heavy. The air in the room felt too still, too fragile. Finally, he looked up. His gaze met Maggie's. And then, it was never just a logging site. Buried truths. Maggie felt the words like a weight against her chest. She had suspected it. She had seen the inconsistencies, the whispers buried in old reports. But hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Richard's voice was quieter now, but no less heavy. They needed a cover, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. So they built a company, built jobs, built a reason for people to come and go. But underneath it all, his jaw tightened. They were doing something else in Blackwood. Maggie felt a slow, sharp pulse in the base of her skull. What? Richard's gaze flickered to the window as if he expected someone to be standing just outside. He exhaled through his nose. "You don't want to know?" Maggie's voice was like iron. "Yes, I do." Richard shook his head, almost to himself. Jonathan did too. Silence. Charlotte inhaled sharply, as if those words had struck something deep inside her. Maggie felt something tighten around her ribs. Jonathan had known, and he had died for it. She leaned forward, her voice low, razor-edged. "You're going to tell me what happened?" Richard was very, very still. Then, finally, "It wasn't an accident." The room seemed to shrink around them, the air suffocating, thick with something unspoken. Maggie's fingers pressed against her temples. The disappearances, the strange man in the footage, the missing foreman, none of it had been coincidence. Jonathan had walked into something much bigger than he realized, and someone had made sure he never walked out. Charlotte's voice was barely above a whisper. Who were they working for? Richard didn't answer. He didn't have to, because the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. They were still out there, and they weren't done yet. The sound outside. A noise broke the silence. A creak, not from inside, from outside. Charlotte's head snapped toward the window. Maggie was already moving, stepping toward the curtains slowly, carefully. The house was deep in the woods, far from any roads, any neighbors. No one should have been out there. But there was something, a shadow, barely visible through the trees, standing, watching. Maggie's pulse thundered in her ears. Charlotte's breath hitched. Richard stood slowly, his face grim, like this was something he had been waiting for. The past wasn't done with them yet. And the secrets of Blackwood weren't meant to stay buried forever. The air was thick with silence, the kind that pressed down like a weight, stretching time, making even the smallest movement feel unnatural. Maggie sat on the edge of the memorial, her fingers tracing the worn engravings of names long since etched into history. The stone was cold beneath her touch, rough with age and weathering. Jonathan Sullivan. The letters were carved deep, permanent. But Jonathan himself had never been found. Her breath curled in the crisp night air as she looked up. The sky was a deep indigo, stars scattered like broken glass, the moon casting long silver shadows across the ground. She wasn't sure why she had come here. Maybe it was the conversation with Richard. Maybe it was the way Charlotte had stared at the floor, her voice trembling as she told Maggie what little she knew. Or maybe it was just habit, grief leading her back to the only place where Jonathan's name still existed. A rustle. Maggie froze, her heart a slow, deliberate thud against her ribs. At first, she thought it was the wind shifting through the trees, but then, movement. A figure stepping carefully through the darkness. Maggie didn't breathe. Then the moonlight shifted, and she saw Charlotte. The younger woman moved with a strange, quiet reverence, holding something in her hands. A flower, small and delicate, its petals pale against the darkness of the night. She knelt beside a grave with no name. Maggie rose slowly, the gravel beneath her boots crunching softly. Charlotte flinched. For a moment, she looked ready to run, but Maggie held up a hand. No sudden movements. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the stem of the flower, her shoulders tense. Maggie took a step closer. Her voice was quiet, careful. Who was she? Charlotte swallowed. My mother. Maggie's breath hitched, but she stayed quiet. Charlotte placed the flower against the grave, her fingers lingering over the dirt before finally standing. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes flickering with something deep, old, and afraid. My mother ran from something in the woods that night. Maggie felt a chill slide down her spine. Charlotte's voice was soft but shaking. Victor Grayson helped her disappear. Maggie's stomach tightened. She thought of Richard, his cold stare, the way he had told her she didn't want to know. And now Charlotte's words. The others never had buried truths. The wind shifted, rustling through the trees, and for a moment Maggie could have sworn she heard something else, something beneath the wind, a whisper, a voice lost to time. Jonathan. She clenched her jaw, shoving the thought away, focusing on Charlotte. What do you mean? Maggie asked, keeping her voice steady. Charlotte hesitated, arms wrapping around herself as if trying to hold something together. "My mother never talked about it," she said. "Not in full sentences, not in ways that made sense." She exhaled shakily, but she always said one thing. It wasn't an accident. Maggie's grip on her coat tightened. Charlotte kept going. "She told me once, when I was little, that she didn't leave Blackwood because she wanted to. She left because she had to. Because if she stayed..." Her voice faltered. Maggie stepped closer. Charlotte swallowed hard. "If she stayed, she would have ended up like the others." Maggie's pulse was slow, deliberate, heavy. "They didn't just disappear," Charlotte said finally. "They were erased." The vanishing Maggie's throat felt dry. Who was chasing her? Charlotte shook her head. "She never said." Silence stretched between them. Then, "She used to wake up screaming." Maggie stilled. Charlotte's hands trembled as she rubbed her arms as if shaking off something too big to carry. "She would have these nightmares," she said. "I didn't understand them when I was little, but now..." She hesitated, closing her eyes for half a second before opening them again. She would wake up gasping, saying she could still hear them. Maggie's breath was shallow, controlled. Charlotte lifted her gaze. "The voices." Maggie's skin prickled. "She said she could hear them calling her name," Charlotte whispered, "even after she left." The weight of the past. Maggie exhaled, trying to make sense of it all. A group of students vanished without a trace. The only survivor ran and never looked back. Grayson Lumber was hiding something, and now there were whispers in the dark, voices that shouldn't be there, echoes of a past that refused to stay buried. Maggie rubbed her temples. "Your mother. How did she know Victor Grayson?" Charlotte hesitated. "He found her," she said, "years after she left Blackwood. She never told me how, just that he came to her, told her to keep quiet, to never tell anyone what she knew." Maggie felt something cold settle deep in her chest. Charlotte looked away. "She died a few years later." Maggie's voice softened. "How?" Charlotte's jaw tightened. "Car accident." A long pause. Maggie knew what that meant. A car accident could be an accident, but it could also be something else entirely, a warning, a message, a silencing. Charlotte exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I don't know if it was connected, but I always wondered." Maggie stared at the nameless grave, her mind turning. The pieces were there, scattered and incomplete. Something had happened in Blackwood that night, something that had made people disappear, and someone had made sure it stayed that way, the presence in the trees. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the clearing, kicking up leaves, rustling branches. Charlotte shivered, glancing over her shoulder. Maggie felt it too, that feeling, the one that had been following her since she came back to Cold Creek, like someone was watching. The trees stood still, but the shadows between them felt too thick, too present. Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you ever feel like something is still out there?" Maggie turned slowly, scanning the darkness, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She didn't answer, because she didn't need to. They both already knew. Somewhere beyond the trees, something was watching, waiting. And the ghosts of Blackwood weren't done with them yet. The Cold Creek police station was one of those buildings that felt like it had never changed. The walls were lined with old photographs of former sheriffs, their expressions worn and tired, like they had all carried some unspoken burden. Maggie sat in the records room, flipping through faded police reports, their edges brittle, yellowed with age. The air smelled of paper and dust, of things long forgotten. She had spent the morning digging through archives, chasing a past that refused to stay buried. Then she found it. A report from October the 19th, 989, the night Jonathan and his friends disappeared. Her eyes moved over the faded type. Official report, Blackwood Incident. Date, October 21, 1989. Filed by Deputy Raymond Wells. Details. Local authorities responded to a missing persons report filed by the families of 7 university students who had gone camping in Blackwood Forest. A search party was dispatched, but no evidence of struggle or signs of forced entry were found at the campsite. Items left behind suggested an abrupt departure, though no footprints or signs of movement led away from the site. Some officers reported hearing strange noises, unidentifiable sounds, described as a mix between radio static and distant voices, though no sources were found. Case remains open, no further evidence recovered. Maggie's fingers tightened around the page. She skimmed through more documents, finding scattered reports over several years, all with a similar pattern. People disappearing near Blackwood, all without explanation. Then there was something else. A statement from a retired officer filed years later. Her eyes narrowed as she read. They told us not to dig too deep, that it was just an accident. But I remember the sounds. I remember standing there at the edge of the trees and feeling like we were being watched, like something was waiting for us to leave. And we did. We always did. The Whispers in Cold Creek, the bar on the outskirts of town, was the kind of place where secrets settled in the wood grain of the tables, where the only thing stronger than the liquor was the weight of things left unsaid. Maggie stepped inside, the smell of old beer, cigarette smoke, and damp wood wrapping around her. The bartender barely looked up. Her eyes swept the room until she found him. An old logger sitting alone at a corner table, a half-empty glass in front of him. She approached, pulling out the chair across from him. "You used to work for Grayson Lumber." He looked up slowly, eyes bloodshot, lined with years of regret. "What gave it away?" he muttered, lifting his drink. Maggie leaned forward. "I'm looking for answers." The man let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "You're about 30 years too late for that, lady." She didn't blink. What were they really doing out there? He stilled. His fingers tightened around the glass, his jaw working as if he were debating whether to answer. Maggie waited. Finally, he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Grayson Lumber wasn't just logging trees out there," he muttered. Maggie's pulse kicked up. Then what were they doing? The man opened his mouth, hesitated. Then, suddenly, his eyes flickered past her, his entire body going rigid. Maggie followed his gaze toward the window near the entrance. A shadow moved outside, a figure, standing too still just beyond the glow of the streetlights. The old logger cursed under his breath, shoving back his chair. "Forget it," he muttered. "I shouldn't be talking to you." Maggie grabbed his wrist. "Wait!" But he yanked free, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide with something dangerously close to fear. "Listen to me," he said, voice low. "Some things are better left alone. Blackwood," he shook his head violently. "You start looking and they'll know. They always know." And with that, he stumbled toward the exit, disappearing into the night. Maggie turned back toward the window. The figure outside was gone, but the feeling remained that she was being watched. A trail gone cold. Maggie sat in her motel room later that night, her laptop screen casting a cold glow across the dark room. She pulled up maps of Blackwood, comparing them to old blueprints of Grayson Lumber operations. There was something off. The maps didn't match. The official records showed a main logging site, but there was another area, a secondary location, one that had been scrubbed from most documents, near where Jonathan's group had disappeared, a place that, on paper, never existed. Maggie stared at the screen. Then she clicked open the USB footage again. Jonathan's grainy voice filled the silence, the video playing like a ghost returning to haunt her. "Welcome to the Great Blackwood Expedition, starring a bunch of overconfident idiots who think they can survive the weekend." She scrubbed through the footage, pausing on the frame of the man standing in the trees. She zoomed in. The Grayson Lumber uniform. The patch. The way he was watching. Her throat tightened. This wasn't just an accident. Jonathan had found something he wasn't supposed to find, and now, so had she. The road back to Blackwood. The next morning, Maggie packed her bag. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was going back. Blackwood still held the truth, and this time, she wasn't leaving without it. The remains of Grayson Lumber's headquarters sat on the far side of Cold Creek, hidden beneath decades of overgrowth. The building was a husk of its former self, its structure sagging under the weight of time. The once bold lettering of Grayson Lumber Co. was barely visible, faded into the rusted metal siding like the company itself had been trying to disappear. Maggie stood outside the chain-link fence, breathing in the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. The gate was still locked, but it wasn't anything a good pair of bolt cutters couldn't handle. The snap of metal breaking echoed through the empty lot as she stepped inside. The place was dead, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like something had stayed behind. Inside the ruins, the air inside was thick with dust, the kind that clung to your skin, to your breath, settling deep in the lungs. The floor was littered with decaying papers, fragments of old invoices, payroll records, nothing useful. Maggie's flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping over collapsed cubicles, rusted filing cabinets, overturned chairs frozen in time. She moved carefully, her footsteps muffled against layers of dirt and debris. Then, in the back of the room, a door, slightly ajar. She pushed it open. Inside was a small records room, walls lined with file cabinets. Most of them had been emptied long ago, drawers left hanging open, their contents either stolen or destroyed. But Maggie had been a journalist for too long to walk away from scraps. She started searching. Her fingers traced over folders warped by moisture, ink bleeding into paper, dates smudged but still legible. Then she found it, a blueprint, water-stained, fragile in her hands but unmistakable, a facility, one that didn't exist on any maps. Project Nightfall. Maggie's eyes narrowed as she scanned the blueprints. The main logging site was there, marked just as it had been on the official records, but beyond it, deeper into Blackwood Forest, was something else. A secondary facility, a place that on paper should never have existed. She flipped through more files, her pulse quickening as she found documents stamped with the name Project Nightfall. Most of it was coded language, technical jargon designed to obscure whatever they had been doing out there. But certain phrases stood out, sharp and unmistakable. Classified research site established 1981. Phase 2 trials abandoned after multiple failures. Personnel instructed to destroy all non-essential records. Final log entry, they weren't supposed to remember. Maggie felt a chill run through her spine. This wasn't just a logging operation gone wrong. Something had been happening in Blackwood, something controlled, something deliberate. And whatever it was, Jonathan and his friends had stumbled into it. Her grip on the papers tightened. She had the proof now. The pieces were finally coming together, but before she could react, a sound, a loud creak. Somewhere behind her, Maggie froze. Her breath went shallow, deliberate, controlled. She wasn't alone. Someone's watching. The darkness behind her shifted. Not just a trick of the light, not just her nerves. Something was moving. She turned slowly, careful not to make a sound. The doorway she had entered through was still open. The main room beyond was empty, at least at first glance. Then she saw it. A shadow, just at the edge of the light where the hallway faded into darkness. Standing still, watching. Maggie's pulse slammed against her ribs. For half a second, neither of them moved. Then, just as she took a step back, the shadow disappeared. Not a retreat, not the sound of footsteps fading away, just gone, like it had never been there at all. But it had. She had felt it watching. A race against the dark, Maggie shoved the files into her bag, heart hammering. She didn't know who was out there, but she knew one thing: she needed to leave. Now, her legs carried her fast, out of the records room, through the debris-strewn hallway. She barely registered the dust kicking up in her wake, the scattered papers fluttering behind her like ghosts. She pushed through the main doors and staggered into the night air, inhaling sharp, cool breath. The lot was empty, but she didn't trust it. She turned, heading straight for her car, but as she reached for the door handle, she caught movement in her peripheral vision, a figure standing at the far end of the lot, near the fence. Too far to see clearly, but she knew. It was them. Whoever had been watching her inside had followed her out. Maggie yanked the car door open, throwing herself inside. The engine roared to life, her tires kicking up gravel as she sped out of the lot, leaving nothing but dust in her wake. She didn't look back, because she knew if she did, they would still be there, watching, waiting. The realization, Maggie didn't slow down until she reached the outskirts of Cold Creek. The roads were empty, dark, stretching endlessly ahead of her. Her fingers were tight around the wheel, her mind racing. She had the proof, the blueprints, the Project Nightfall files, the last entry confirming it all. But none of it would matter if she didn't make it out alive. This wasn't just an old story, it was still happening. People were still watching, still making sure no one remembered, and now they knew she did. The road to Blackwood Forest was silent, stretching long and dark beneath a sky that had begun to swallow the last remnants of daylight. Maggie gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles stiff, her breath measured. Charlotte sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the tree line as it grew denser, the pines pressing in on either side of them like sentinels guarding something they weren't meant to see. Neither of them had spoken much since leaving Cold Creek. There was nothing left to say. They knew what they were driving toward. And it wasn't just the past. It was something that had been waiting for them. The forest floor. The trail was barely visible, swallowed by time and nature's quiet reclaiming. Branches clawed at their jackets as they walked, boots sinking into the damp earth, the air thick with the scent of moss, rotting leaves, and something faintly metallic. Maggie checked the map she had printed from the old blueprints, her fingers tracing the coordinates. "This is where it should be," she muttered. Charlotte hesitated beside her. Ahead, the trees thinned, revealing a shallow dip in the landscape, an area where the ground had caved in long ago. They stepped closer, and then they saw it. A collapsed underground structure, barely visible beneath the tangled roots and creeping vines. Charlotte exhaled sharply, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jesus!" Maggie knelt beside the edge, brushing away the overgrowth. Beneath layers of dirt and decay, she could see metal, rusted, twisted. A hatch, half buried in the earth. She looked up at Charlotte. "Help me clear it." Charlotte hesitated only a second before crouching down beside her, pulling at the debris. The metal groaned beneath their weight, brittle from age but still solid enough to tell them what they needed to know. This wasn't just an abandoned bunker. It had been sealed. Someone had buried it on purpose. A place of containment inside, the air was stale and unmoving, thick with dust and the lingering scent of damp metal. The space was small, corridors leading to what looked like storage rooms, equipment scattered across the floor. Charlotte ran her fingers over the wall, eyes narrowing. This wasn't just a research facility. Maggie followed her gaze. There were chains bolted into the walls, rusted but still intact. Not for machinery, for restraint. And then Charlotte froze, her breath hitched, sharp and sudden. Maggie turned. On the far wall, beneath layers of grime and decay, a bone-white handprint. Small, human, stained into the surface like a ghost refusing to fade. Charlotte took a step back, shaking her head. "This isn't just a graveyard," she whispered. "It's a warning." Maggie's pulse pounded in her ears. What the hell had been happening here? The whispering dark? They moved carefully, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The deeper they went, the more the truth began to take shape. Maggie found a control panel covered in dust, its switches rusted, its labels faded, but she could still make out the words, PHS-2 initiated. Subjects under observation. Charlotte's hands trembled as she picked up a file from the floor, its edges curled with water damage. She flipped through the pages, her breath hitching on one particular entry. Subjects displayed increased sensitivity to external stimuli. Prolonged exposure resulted in heightened paranoia, auditory hallucinations, and eventual dissociation from reality. Phase 2 trials discontinued after multiple failures. Maggie felt her stomach turn. This wasn't an accident. This was a test. Jonathan and his friends hadn't just walked into a tragedy, they had walked into something designed to break them, the sound that shouldn't exist. A noise echoed down the corridor, a low whispering sound like wind moving through tight spaces, except there was no wind down here. Charlotte went rigid, her fingers digging into Maggie's sleeve. Maggie turned off her flashlight, pulling Charlotte against the wall. They stood still, silent, barely breathing. The sound grew, closer. Maggie's skin prickled with something primal. Then, a shadow moved at the end of the hallway. Not fast, not running, just standing there, watching. Charlotte's grip tightened. "Tell me you see that." Maggie did, and it was looking right at them. The choice they needed to leave. Maggie grabbed Charlotte's wrist, pulling her back the way they came, moving fast but careful, her heartbeat thudding like a drum against her ribs. The air felt heavier, the shadows pressing in as if the very walls were trying to keep them inside. They climbed out of the structure, breath ragged, boots kicking up dirt as they broke into a run. Maggie didn't dare look back. They didn't stop until they reached the car, slamming the doors shut, gasping for breath. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Charlotte whispered the words neither of them wanted to say out loud. "We weren't alone down there." Maggie stared at the forest, at the darkness beyond the trees. She knew Charlotte was right, because something had followed them out. The world didn't change overnight, but it felt like it should have. Richard Grayson had been taken into custody just after dawn, escorted out of his secluded home in Elk Valley by 2 federal agents. The news had spread like wildfire, rippling through Cold Creek and beyond. The media latched onto the story. The disgraced CEO, the decades-old conspiracy, the lost students whose names had nearly faded into obscurity. But for Maggie, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a wound that had been pried open, bleeding history and secrets that refused to stay buried. The silence that followed Maggie sat in the motel room, staring at the news broadcast on the television. Muted headlines rolled across the screen. Grayson arrested in cold case investigation. Blackwood tragedy. New evidence suggests foul play. But it all felt too neat. Maggie had spent years unraveling lies disguised as facts, and she knew the truth never ended with a single name. Richard Grayson had kept secrets, yes, but he wasn't the only one. She picked up her phone, scrolling through messages from journalists, old contacts, people suddenly interested in a case that had sat untouched for more than 30 years. The noise of it all, the cameras, the questions, the sudden urgency from people who had never cared before, felt wrong, like a distraction, like she was still missing something. "You think it ends with me?" The interrogation footage had been leaked within hours. Maggie watched it from her laptop, the low-resolution video casting Richard Grayson in grainy shadows. He sat with his hands clasped, his face unreadable, calm. Too calm. The federal agent across from him leaned forward. "Mr. Grayson, you were aware of the classified operations conducted at the Blackwood site, correct?" Richard exhaled through his nose, a slight smile pulling at the corner of his lips. "You already know the answer to that." "Then say it for the record." A pause. Then, "The facility existed," he admitted, "but you won't find much left of it now." Maggie's fingers hovered over the pause button. The agent's voice was steady. "What were you testing there?" Another pause. Richard's gaze lifted, his smile widened just slightly, but it wasn't amusement, it was something else. "You think it ends with me?" Silence. The agent stiffened. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping just above a whisper. "You think I was the only one keeping the doors closed?" A chill curled down Maggie's spine. She clicked out of the video. She had seen enough. The file that opened itself. The motel room was too quiet. Maggie's laptop screen flickered, a new file suddenly appearing in the USB folder. She frowned. She hadn't touched anything. Her fingers hesitated before clicking it open. A video file. One that hadn't been there before. The timestamp read October 1989. Maggie's breath hitched. She pressed play. Jonathan's last message. The screen flickered with static before stabilizing. Jonathan's face appeared. Maggie's chest clenched so tightly it hurt. He looked tired, but focused, the dim glow of a flashlight casting harsh shadows across his face. "If you're watching this," he whispered, voice low, urgent, "it means they never stopped looking." Maggie's pulse hammered. Jonathan's breath shuddered, his eyes darting towards something just out of frame. "They know we found it," he continued. "They were waiting for us. We thought we were alone, but we—" The screen jumped, distorted for a second before clearing again. Jonathan's voice dropped lower. "They were watching us the whole time." A noise in the background. A low, distorted hum, almost like a voice beneath the static. Maggie's stomach turned. Jonathan's expression shifted, a flash of fear, realization. "Maggie?" The video cut to black, a door left open. Maggie stared at the screen, her heart lodged in her throat. The silence in the room felt thick, pressing in from all sides. Jonathan had known. He had known he wouldn't make it out of Blackwood. But more than that, he had known someone was still watching. Maggie's eyes drifted back to the laptop screen. The cursor hovered over the blackness where the video had ended. A single thought looped in her mind over and over. If they never stopped looking, then neither would she.